Everybody liked to whisper about the hermit on the 4th floor. Mr. Kobayashi. Hikikomori is the Japanese word for a social recluse, and it was also the word that the isolated gentleman had scrawled on his front door in white chalk. I'm no snooper. I was his next-door neighbour. I had to walk past Kobayashi's flat every day. There was a deep well in my gut, and it churned whenever I passed flat 11. The awful nature of that man's existence reminded me of my own well-mother. She took her life when I was only a boy. Depression had cast a pall over our household, and in those final months we'd been unable to convince her to leave her room, or even her bed. The more my father pushed, the worse she became. The world was too much for her, until, eventually... Well, anyway, I lived in that apartment building for 5 years without seeing the mysterious man. No tenant had ever seen him, in fact. We only knew about his existence from the landlady, Mrs. Grisham. I haven't seen him in the flesh since he moved here, she told us. And when was that? Tyson asked. 2012, Mrs. Grisham replied. He was a frail fellow, but he seemed perfectly ordinary. I've always tried to respect his privacy. He sends me photographs of the flat, so I've never intruded. After all, it's an illness. I feel deeply sorry for the man. An obvious question sprang to mind. How do you know he hasn't died? I asked, much to Tyson's amusement. Mrs. Grisham smiled. I know landlords and landladies are meant to be wicked, Sean, but I do contact my tenants. Mr. Kobayashi and I speak on the phone. The main thing is that he pays his rent on time. A neat brown envelope at the end of the month. And I won't tell you where he leaves it, you little thieves. Ah, rent. That's what it's really about, Tyson teased, and Mrs. Grisham scowled. What about food? I asked. He has to eat. As far as I'm aware, he has always used a fire escape to accept deliveries, Mrs. Grisham said. They never see him, of course. They drop parcels outside his window. It's all fine in my books, mind. I'm just glad the man has found some way to live his life. Does he have a large inheritance? I asked. I'm trying to figure out how he pays the bills. OnlyFans? Tyson said, smirking. Mrs. Grisham sighed. I think that's enough gossip for one day. It's been lovely talking to you delightful boys, as always. Sean, would you mind telling Freya that her rent is late again? Tyson and I did as our landlady asked, and we strolled down the corridor to my girlfriend's flat. Neither of us glanced at Mr. Kobayashi's door. In spite of our jokes, we both feared that apartment. The scrawled word, Hikikomori, felt so unhinged in design. It was a warning more than anything. I'd always believed that. At night, through the wall, I would hear haunting noises from Kobayashi's flat. Laboured breathing, gurgling, and, one terrible time, a primal wail that filled my body with a paralysing weight. Earth to Sean, Tyson chuckled. You mind waiting for me at your girl's place? Or is it your place now? I rolled my eyes. Not yet, Tyson. He laughed. Still don't see why you two live in separate flats. Get a room already. Anyway, I've Gotta go check on the baby. I often marvelled at the fact that Tyson, the most immature man I knew, had a wife and a child, Rebecca and Jack. Wonders never ceased on the 4th floor. That evening, Tyson, Rebecca, Freya, and I ate dinner around my girlfriend's cramped dining table. Little baby Jack sat and squealed excitably in his big chair. "Oh, has Sean told you about the latest development with Mr. Kobayashi?" Tyson asked, bouncing baby Jack on his lap. Freya groaned. "Have you two been pestering Mrs. Grisham again?" "We finally got somewhere," I grinned. "Mr. Kobayashi does, in fact, interact with the world. He's not dead." "Great," Rebecca said, rolling her eyes. "Mystery solved. Will you two drop it now?" "Red!" Jack cried, gleefully pointing at the window. I looked at the fire escape and noticed the delivery man in a red jacket. "Oh, look," I said, chuckling. "That must be one of Kobayashi's visitors." "Now you mention it, I have noticed him before," Freya said. "Who dares me to go to Kobayashi's window?" Tyson snorted, passing the baby to his wife and drunkenly stumbling to his feet. "Nobody," Rebecca said. "I think that's enough wine for one night. Let's head back to the flat and put Jack to bed." Tyson grumpily agreed, and the pair grabbed their things before heading to the door. Whilst Freya chatted with Rebecca, Tyson leaned over to me. His breath reeked of cheap liquor, and I scrunched my face into a disapproving grimace. Take a picture, right? Take a picture of Mr. Kobayashi's flat, right, from the fire escape. He slurred. I dare you. 500 quid. I rolled my eyes. Go home, you mess. Too little. Okay. 600 quid. Tyson said, giggling as he opened PayPal on his phone. Look, it's there. I'm not messing around, right? Just send me a picture. No. Even better. Film a video, right? And then I'll transfer. Oh, you know what? £700. I was tipsy, but nowhere near as intoxicated as Tyson. I definitely had enough control of my mental faculties to decline his moronic dare. But I accepted. £600 for a photograph. I'd have been an idiot to turn that down, knowing what I knew then. Knowing what I know now, of course. I wished Freya a good night, making up an excuse about having some work to do. So I walked through my darkened flat, beelining for the window that led onto the fire escape. I left my window ajar and gently plopped onto the metal walkway attached to our apartment building. After padding softly along the walkway, I crouched outside flat 11 and eyed Mr. Kobayashi's window. My phone was in my shaky hand. I just hoped my friend wouldn't backtrack on the deal when he sobered up. I turned on the flash, as I suspected that it would be too dark to distinguish anything in the reclusive man's flat. But when I peeked over the windowsill to look into his darkened home, I was met with an utterly terrible sight. I have no idea what photos Mr. Kobayashi sent to Mrs. Grisham for her flat inspections. In the lion's lightless den, bloody body parts hung from the wall, a macabre collection of fleshy trophies. But the true terror lay in the centre of the room. Mr. Kobayashi was on his haunches, plunging into the gutted abdomen of a crumpled corpse on the carpet. Beside him, a red jacket was draped over a chair. It was the delivery man. I clasped my mouth, muffling a scream that attempted to slither through my lips. The elderly Japanese man didn't look frail to me. He was emaciated, but far larger than any man I'd ever seen. His fingernails were razors that effortlessly diced the innards of his victim into neat chunks of meat. He lifted a piece to his greedy, quivering lips, and then, on the verge of consuming his prepared meal, Mr. Kobayashi paused. He noticed the glow of the phone light that was illuminating his wicked work. When he looked towards the window, I was petrified by his face. His eye sockets were hollow, but he somehow saw the light. He saw me. His lips were coated in blood, and his jaw hung loosely. Then he unleashed an awful sound, a wailing shriek. Tumbling backwards, I dropped my phone between the metal bars of the fire escape flooring, and I watched it plummet to the deserted alley below. Too afraid to stand, I crawled towards my window. I was haunted by the silence of Kobayashi's flat, but I longed for it when I heard the sinister sound of glass panes sliding apart behind me. The Hikikomori's claw-like fingers crept through his open window, and I screamed, scrambling over the ledge into my flat. I hurriedly shut my own window and backed through my empty, blackened apartment. The inhuman man crawled into my line of sight. With nothing but a thin sheet of glass between us, he surveyed me from the fire escape, eyeing me with eyeless sockets, and then I could only watch in horror as he began to pound ferociously on the window. Cracks started to form. After frantically fumbling with the handle behind my back, too afraid to take my eyes off the abomination, I felt the front door open, and I finally made it into the corridor. Locking my flat behind me, I expected to hear smashing glass, but there was only dreadful silence. I pounded on Freya's door, and she let me inside. One look at the ghastly expression on my face was sufficient for her to realize that this was no practical joke. She immediately dialed 999, but it wasn't the first time they'd been called about Mr. Kobayashi. Missing person cases had been tied to the old man before. No evidence had ever been found. And on that night, when the police broke into flat 11, Mr. Kobayashi was gone. Though, in truth, Mr. Kobayashi had been gone for a long time, hadn't he? After all, whatever lived in that awful apartment, it was no man.